I have seen lands beyond the pole that should not exist. That single sentence written in fountain pen is the line investigators keep returning to. It comes from a typed manuscript that surfaced in private hands in the early 1990s, attributed to Admiral Richard E. Byrd, United States Navy, dated February of 1947. The original notebook has never been produced for public examination. What exists are transcribed pages, a chain of custody traced through estate sales, and a story that the man who allegedly wrote it never publicly denied and never publicly confirmed. He died in his sleep in Boston on March 11, 1957, 10 years after the flight the diary describes. The pages did not begin to circulate until after the funeral. The man at the center of this is not a fringe figure. Richard Byrd was the most decorated officer in the United States Navy at the time of his death. Medal of Honor, Navy Cross, Distinguished Service Medal, the first man to fly over the North Pole in May of 1926, the first man to fly over the South Pole in November of 1929. By 1947, when this diary entry is dated, he was officer in charge of U.S. Antarctic programs and the public face of American polar exploration. His credibility, until this episode, was untouchable. Heads of state took his calls, newsreels opened with his name. So when a document attributed to that man describes flying past the South Pole, looking down at green terrain, ice-free valleys, and what he calls living mammoths, the standard reflex is to dismiss the document. And that reflex is reasonable. It is also where this story stops being simple. Because the diary is one piece, the expedition that frames it is another. And what happened to the 4,700 men who went south with Byrd in the winter of 1946 and 1947, and why their 8-month operation was canceled inside of 8 weeks, is documented, declassified, and on the record at the Naval History and Heritage Command. That part is not in dispute. If the diary is real, every man on that expedition saw something that has never been spoken of in public. If the U.S. Navy buried it, the cover-up has held for almost 80 years, across administrations of both parties, across the entire Cold War, across the Internet age. That is the proposition this video is going to lay out, piece by documented piece. If you're someone who pays attention to what mainstream history leaves on the cutting room floor, this channel covers exactly that. The expeditions the textbooks skip past, the documents the National Archives quietly downgrade, the men who came back from somewhere and were told never to speak of it. Subscribe and stay with me, because what we're about to walk through with the Byrd file is the tip of a much larger pattern. Begin with the man, because the man is the spine of the case. Richard Byrd was born in Winchester, Virginia in 1888. Naval Academy, class of 1912. Aviator. By the time he was 38 years old, he was claiming the first overflight of the North Pole, a claim that some modern researchers have questioned but which the Navy formally credited and which earned him the Medal of Honor. 3 years later, in November of 1929, he led the flight that crossed the South Pole and returned. His Antarctic base, Little America, became one of the most famous addresses in the world. Through the 1930s and 40s, he led 4 major expeditions to the southern continent. He spent a winter alone at an advanced weather station in 1934 and nearly died of carbon monoxide poisoning, an episode he wrote about in a book called Alone that is still in print. The man was not an opportunist. He was the institution. That is the figure who, in late 1946, was placed in command of the largest Antarctic operation ever assembled by any nation. Operation Highjump, officially designated the United States Navy Antarctic Developments Program. Task Force 68, 13 ships, 23 aircraft, 4,700 men, 1 aircraft carrier, the USS Philippine Sea, 2 seaplane tenders, a submarine, the USS Senate, icebreakers, destroyers. The official mission, as published, was training, terrain familiarization, and the establishment of a temporary base called Little America 4. The published duration was 8 months. The operation departed in waves through August of 1946. The main task force reached Antarctic waters in late December. By February 22, 1947, less than 2 months into the alleged 8-month mission, the entire force had been ordered to withdraw. The icebreakers turned north. The carrier turned north. The seaplane tenders broke camp. The men were home by spring. The mainstream explanation for the early withdrawal is straightforward, and it deserves a fair hearing. The standard account says the Antarctic summer was closing faster than projected. Ice conditions were harder than the Navy had modeled. Equipment was failing in temperatures the gear had not been designed for. There had been a fatal accident on December 30, 1946, when a PBM Mariner flying boat called George I crashed into a slope on Thurston Island in low visibility. 3 men were killed. The aircraft wreckage is still there. That accident is fully documented. 6 survivors were rescued 13 days later. The orthodox reading is that the Navy, looking at the casualty, the weather, and the aging gear, made the conservative call and pulled the force out early. That is a clean explanation. It is also incomplete, because 8 weeks is not an early withdrawal from an 8-month operation. 8 weeks is a different operation entirely. The Navy had budgeted, fueled, provisioned, and manned Highjump for 240 days of active deployment. They executed roughly 56. The ratio is too steep for weather and a single aircraft loss. The Mariner accident happened in the final days of December. The withdrawal order came almost 2 months later, after the worst of the polar weather had already passed and as the Antarctic summer was reaching its operational peak. Whatever ended Highjump ended it during the window the operation had been built for, not before it. And here is where the file gets specific. After the withdrawal, in March of 1947, Byrd flew to Santiago, Chile, on his way back to the United States. There, on March 5, 1947, he gave an interview to a journalist named Lee Van Otta, who was working for the International News Service. The interview was published in the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio. That publication exists. The article exists. It is in the El Mercurio archives. The translated quote attributed to Byrd in that article reads as follows: "It is necessary for the United States to take defensive actions against aerial objects which come from the polar regions." Byrd added that, in the case of a new war, the United States could be attacked by planes flying over one or both poles. And then he said this: "There is a land beyond the pole that is the very center of the great unknown." That sentence is real. That sentence was published in 1947. That sentence has never been retracted by Byrd, by the Navy, or by his estate. Read the standard version of Operation Highjump, and that quote will not appear. It is not in the Navy's official summary. It is not in the popular history books. It survives in the El Mercurio archive, in researcher footnotes, and in the work of a small number of investigative writers who have tracked it down across the decades. That is the first decisive failure point in the orthodox account. Because the orthodox account says Highjump was a routine training operation that ran into bad weather. The man who commanded that operation, 3 weeks after it ended, told a journalist on the record that the United States needed to defend itself against aerial objects coming from the polar regions, and that there was a land beyond the pole at the center of the great unknown. Those are not the words of a commander returning from a routine cold weather drill. Now, layer in the diary. The document attributed to Byrd, the one that surfaced after his death, claims to record the events of a single flight on February 19, 1947, 3 days before the order to withdraw. According to the manuscript, Byrd took off from his base on a long-range reconnaissance flight beyond the South Pole. The compass began to spin. The terrain below the aircraft changed. Ice gave way to barren ground, then to green valleys, then to forests. The diary describes a herd of large, dark animals that the writer compares to woolly mammoths. It describes mountain ranges that should not be there. And then, the manuscript says, the aircraft was met in the air by craft of a kind he had never seen, and guided down to a landing in a valley where he was received by representatives of a civilization that called itself, in the document, the Old Race. The The diary says he was given a message for the leaders of the surface world. He was returned to his aircraft. He flew home, and he was ordered, the manuscript claims, to say nothing. That is the document. That is what it says. The orthodox response to the document is that it is a forgery, that the language is wrong for 1947, that no original notebook has ever been produced, that the typescript appeared in the early 1990s through hands that cannot be fully verified. All of that is fair. None of that is conclusive, because the El Mercurio interview exists, and the El Mercurio interview, in the man's own words on the public record, says there are lands beyond the pole and aerial objects coming from polar regions that the United States needs to defend against. Whatever you make of the diary, the interview is harder to dismiss. And the interview was given by a man who, 3 weeks earlier, had been pulled out of the largest Antarctic operation in history 6 months ahead of schedule. The man who has done the most patient archival work on this episode is not a fringe author. His name is Timothy Good, British, author of Above Top Secret, published by Sidgwick and Jackson in 1987, an investigation that is still cited in serious aerospace literature. Good has spent decades working through declassified Navy correspondence, contemporary press coverage, and the public record on Highjump. He is on the record stating that the El Mercurio interview is authentic, that the operation's premature withdrawal is unexplained by the official files, and that something in the southern continent in early 1947 produced a response by the United States military that the public record does not match. Good is not the only researcher to take that position. He is the most credentialed. And then there is the second document, the one that even mainstream historians acknowledge. In 1954, 7 years after Highjump, Byrd participated in another Antarctic expedition called Operation Deep Freeze. He was now 66 years old. He gave another interview, this one filmed and broadcast in the United States on a program called Longine's Chronoscope. The footage exists. It is in the National Archives. In that broadcast, in his own voice, Byrd referred to Antarctica as, and the phrasing here is exact, the most important place in the world for science and for the future. He did not elaborate. He did not say what science. He did not say what future. The interviewer moved on. 3 years later, in March of 1957, Byrd was dead. His last public statement on Antarctica was that it was the most important place in the world. The pattern that begins to emerge from the documented record is not theatrical. It is procedural. A massive military operation canceled in 8 weeks. A commander who, on the public record in a foreign newspaper, refers to lands beyond the pole and aerial threats from the poles. The same commander, 7 years later, telling American television that the southern continent is the most important place left on Earth. And then, after his death, a manuscript that purports to fill in the gap between those two statements. Whether the manuscript is genuine or not, the gap is real. The official record does not close it. This is the suppression motif, and in the Byrd case, it is unusually well documented. Begin with the men. 4,700 sailors and airmen served on Operation Highjump. Many of them lived into the 1990s and the 2000s. Almost none of them, on the record, ever spoke about anything unusual on the expedition. There are scattered third-hand accounts, son of a sailor stories, deathbed half-sentences. There is no organized testimony. For comparison, the men of the Pacific War, the men of Korea, the men of every major post-war deployment produced thousands of pages of memoir and interview. The Highjump generation did not. Whatever discipline held them, held. Then look at the official files. The complete operational logs of Highjump, including aircraft mission reports, were classified at the time of withdrawal. Significant portions were declassified through the 1970s and 1980s. The flight log for February 19, 1947, the date the diary alleges Byrd's anomalous reconnaissance flight took place, has gaps. Some sources describe it as missing. The Navy's official summary describes the date as a routine support day. Aircraft maintenance records for that period, requested by independent researchers under the Freedom of Information Act, returned partial responses. The Navy has never produced a complete sortie log for the final weeks of the operation. And then, there is the Mariner crash. The PBM George I that went down on December 30th, 1946, with the loss of 3 men. The wreckage is in a known location on Thurston Island. It has never been recovered. The black box equivalent of the period, the flight recorder paperwork, was destroyed with the aircraft. The 6 survivors gave statements. Those statements describe weather, navigation, impact. They do not describe what the flight was looking for. The mission profile of George I, in the unredacted form, has not been released. None of these gaps by themselves prove anything. Together, they form a pattern. And the pattern is not one of routine bureaucratic loss. It is the pattern that researchers learned to recognize when an operation was something other than what it was publicly described as. The implications, if you sit with the documented portion of the case, expand outward. At the smallest scale, the question is whether one man, the most decorated naval officer of his era, told the truth in a Chilean newspaper in March of 1947. At a wider scale, the question is whether the largest Antarctic operation in human history was terminated early because of what it found, and whether the United States Navy has been operating under a continuity of silence about that finding for almost 80 years. At the widest scale, the question is, what is in Antarctica that requires that silence? Because the silence is not theoretical. It is observable. The continent is governed by the Antarctic Treaty of 1959, signed in Washington by 12 nations. That treaty designates the entire continent for peaceful scientific use, prohibits military activity, prohibits mineral extraction, and restricts access. It is the only continent on Earth that no nation owns and no civilian can casually visit. It is patrolled, monitored, and mapped, and the mapping itself, particularly the subglacial mapping, is largely the product of military and intelligence resources. In 2018, NASA's Operation Icebridge program released radar data showing a continent-sized gravitational anomaly beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet. In 2020, researchers at the University of Texas at Austin, working with airborne ice-penetrating radar, identified a network of subglacial lakes and channels under West Antarctica, large enough to qualify as a buried hydrological system. In 2023, an international team published a paper in Nature Communications describing a flat, level landscape preserved beneath the East Antarctic ice that has not seen open sky for at least 14 million years. None of those findings on their own validate Byrd's diary. None of them refute it either. They describe a continent whose interior we have not actually seen, only inferred, and whose preserved subsurface is older and stranger than the ice that covers it. This is where the documented part of the file ends and the implications begin. Maybe Byrd's diary is a forgery. Maybe a researcher in the late 1980s took a real interview and a real anomaly and wrote backward to fill in the gap. Maybe there is no chamber, no old race, no message. Maybe the most decorated naval officer in American history simply spoke loosely to a Chilean reporter in March of 1947, said the wrong thing about polar threats, and the Navy quietly let it pass without correction because the man was a national figure and the Cold War was beginning, and an admiral's offhand remark was not worth a press release. Maybe Highjump ended early because the gear was old and the weather was bad, and the Mariner crash unsettled the brass. Or maybe the man who flew over both poles, the man who wintered alone in the Antarctic in 1934, the man who spent more time on the southern continent than any officer of his generation, saw something on February 19, 1947, that he could not put on the record, that his Navy could not allow him to put on the record, and that he carried for 10 years until he died in his sleep in Boston in March of 1957. Maybe the diary surfaced because, at some point, someone who had been close to him decided that the silence had held long enough. The interview is real. The early withdrawal is real. The 4,700 men who went south and came back 2 months later and never spoke of it are real. The phrase, "the most important place left on Earth," is real, and it was the last thing he ever said in public about the continent. You can decide for yourself what to do with that. If you've made it this far, you already know. The official record on Antarctica is missing pieces, and you already suspect the silence around the southern continent is not accidental. This channel is for people who notice that. Next, I'm breaking down the 7 final entries in Admiral Byrd's diary, the ones that come after the flight on February 19th, the ones the researchers say he was never the same after writing. Click the video on screen now.